Senator Tillis and I have shared a commitment to supporting our service members and providing them with the services, resources, and care that they need. That commitment extends to our shared drive to address the debilitating and extensive medical issues and disabilities caused by the use of burn pits in recent combat operations. When our service members deploy, they expect to face risks, but those risks should not come from the operations of our own bases. And when they do, we must take responsibility. I look forward to continuing to work together on this issue. I was also glad to hear that President Biden prioritized addressing this cost of war in the State of the Union and again in Texas last week. He described the clear cause and effect of this crisis, saying, quote, "The burn pits that incinerate the wastes of war, medical and hazardous material, jet fuel, and so much more were just dug in big pits, not far from where our veterans were sleeping. And when our troops came home, the fittest among them, the greatest fighting force in the history of the world, too many of them were not the same. Headaches, numbness, dizziness, cancer." That tells the whole story. Men and women who deployed at the peak of physical fitness are now fighting to survive. This is a health crisis among our armed services. Most public attention on this issue has been focused on the treatment of veterans at the Veterans Administration, but these health issues stem from time on active duty and can begin presenting while our troops are still serving. The DoD has a critical role to play in protecting the health of our current and transitioning service members. That's why today's hearing is so critical. We need to have a better understanding of how toxic exposure has been and is being tracked and documented, and the barriers that have prevented that documentation from being done effectively. Congress has already recognized DoD's responsibility and has passed legislation to require DoD to take appropriate measures, including requiring inclusion of exposure to open burn pits in post-deployment health assessments of service members returning from deployment, recording burn pit registration and electronic health records, and mandatory training for military health care providers on the effects of burn pit exposure. But we need to go further. We need to build an understanding of the health impacts of toxic exposure and our knowledge of when such exposure is occurring. And we must make that information available to service members, their families, and the medical professionals they rely on in order to properly and adequately care for our troops who have been exposed. As President Biden said, quote, "We need to know more about which of our veterans may have been exposed to burn pits in the first place or other environmental toxins during their service and record possible exposure before service members separate from the military." End of quote. Today's witnesses will help provide clarity in both of those areas. Our first panel consists of DoD witnesses who will testify about the health effects of toxic exposure, assessment of health impacts, documentation of potential exposure, and monitoring of exposure. Witnesses on our second panel will share what they have seen or experienced firsthand on this issue and will provide recommendations for ensuring the health and safety of our service members. Witnesses for our first panel include Dr. Terry M. Rausch, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Readiness Policy and Oversight, Dr. Raul Mirza, Division Chief of Occupational Environmental Medicine, Clinical Public Health and Epidemiology, U.S. Army Public Health Center, Colonel Adam J. Newell, Chief of Medical Readiness, Air Force Medical Readiness Agency, and Captain Brian L. Feldman, Commander, Navy and Marine Corps Public Health Center. I'll introduce the second panel after we receive the testimony of the first panel. Again, thank you for being here today. And just for Senator Tillis's benefit, I told him how wonderful you are at the opening of my remarks.
Could you please repeat that? And I'm sorry I'm running late. I went ahead and voted, so I figured we could tag team and not disrupt the hearing. But thank you all for being here. Senator Gillibrand, thank you for holding the hearing and your advocacy, the work that I'm well aware of in Veterans Affairs that we need to continue to work on. I've worked on this subject for a long time. When I first came to the Senate, I was involved with trying to get the presumptions in place for Camp Lejeune toxic exposures down there. Fortunately, after a lot of back and forth with the VA, we were successful, but we have more work to do. And I'm happy that the Veterans Affairs committee has unanimously reported out a bill on toxic substances. We're going to continue to work in the VA committee to do right by those who were exposed and who are now in veteran status. The objective of today's hearing, though, and it's something that I've said on a number of fronts, whether it's traumatic brain injury, low-level concussive events, things that men and women, while they're in active status, experience that could ultimately result in problems in the long term. I think we have an opportunity to get ahead of it. Instead of waiting for the next burn pit or waiting for the next Agent Orange, what more can we do? Downrange, what more can we do in our military installations to understand the potential risk that we're putting our men and women, potentially putting them in a position to where they too are going to have negative health consequences, either while they're serving or after they transition to veteran status. So today, I look forward to talking with you all about how we can get ahead of the curve, how we can do a better job of tracking potential exposures so that it makes it very easy later on if we get into a situation. We can't always, when we're downrange, know what we're going to get exposed to. But once we know it, then we should make sure that every single electronic health record of any man or woman who's exposed to it is updated. And maybe we can even anticipate that they're at risk before they ever exhibit the first symptom. That's the end goal, and I'm sure that that you all, the witnesses, agree that that should be an end goal of everybody. So I look forward to this testimony today. I look forward to moving up in the cycle, talking with the DOD to figure out what more we can do to actually begin to bend the curve on some of the consequences that we have to deal with our men and women in uniform and with the men and women who have served before. So thank you all. Look forward to your testimony.
Colonel Newell? Dr. Roush.
I got it. Chairwoman Gillibrand, Ranking Member Tillis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the department to testify for the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on military exposures of concern, including airborne hazards and open burn pits. I'm pleased to represent the Office of the Secretary of Defense and have the opportunity to discuss the department's actions in addressing airborne contaminants and open burn pits in military operations and the potential health effects to our service members and veterans. Joining me today and representing their military departments are Colonel Newell from the Air Force, Dr. Mirza from the Army, and Captain Feldman from the Navy. The department recognizes the concerns about the potential health impact of burn pits and other airborne exposures. The relationship between burn pit exposure and illness is a topic of active research by the department, the VA, national academies of science, engineering, and medicine, and other research institutions. The department and VA continue to support and fund these research efforts to better understand any health effects that will better inform the health care provided to our service members and veterans. Healthcare providers play a critical role in understanding health-related exposures and becoming proficient in assessing patients' exposure concerns. This month, the department will launch an updated version of its airborne hazards and open burn pit registry overview course for healthcare providers. In addition to the training course, an airborne exposure clinical toolbox is available to our healthcare providers. The department and the VA continue to share education, training, and outreach products to improve exposure-related clinical care. Airborne hazards pose potential acute and chronic health effects during deployment and post-deployment. As such, the department has enhanced its pre- and post-deployment related health assessments and the separation health assessment to include more specific occupational and environmental exposure questions, including questions on burn pits and other airborne hazards. The department and VA are currently collaborating on multiple efforts, including the development of the first ever individual longitudinal exposure record. We call it the ILR, providing exposure summaries by leveraging personnel location, environmental monitoring, and health assessment data. The department is also conducting a comprehensive exposure monitoring capabilities-based assessment aimed at improving individual and area exposure monitoring and record keeping across the installation, training, and deployed environments. In closing, the department remains committed to continually improving our understanding of exposures of concern and potential health effects in order to prevent and mitigate exposures and clinically assess, treat, and care for our service members and veterans. Madam Chairwoman, that concludes my opening remark, and we stand ready to address your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roush. Dr. Roush, what does DoD do in the field to track toxic exposure for individual service members, and are there any innovative ways the department is working to do so?
Thank you for the question. I'll start off, and my colleagues can provide any more detail. It primarily starts, if we're talking about the deployed environment, it primarily starts on site with our preventive medicine teams that are collecting environmental data, whether it be airborne data, soil data, water data, and all of that data that's being collected. And it does obviously include data that's generated from military operations, to include burn pits where there are. That data is collected by our preventive medicine units. It's captured in a large database called DOORS, and specific to DOORS, it's called DOORS IH. IH stands for Industrial Hygiene. And that database will then become available to then feed into the ILR, which is the longitudinal exposure record. And in addition, the ILR will not only scrape environmental health assessment data from DOORS, it will also scrape data from personnel locations. So you can match the individual service member and his or her location to the environmental health data that's being captured in DOORS, and it will then, ILR will then present that data in what we call a joint longitudinal viewer, and summarize that data for the healthcare professional. So he or she will be able to see where that service member was at any point in time, what they were exposed to, and then be able to...
What is the time point this data starts? Do you have data going back to what point in time?
Well, preventive medicine units are part of the deployed force, and so they could be doing their environmental health assessments on a weekly basis. They could be hanging air monitors.
But when did you start collecting this data?
When I was on active duty in 1999, we were collecting it in Bosnia and Kosovo.
Great. Now, you mentioned also, so you have it back to 1999 at least, and you said there are active burn pits today that you're monitoring. Where are those burn pits located?
It's my understanding that there are active burn pits in the CENTCOM area of operations. I can provide more. I can get with CENTCOM, and we can provide more detailed information.
Yes,
But
please, because I understood that the DOD now, as a matter of policy, has determined that they will no longer use burn pits as a way to dispose of waste. So if that's not the case, I just need to know that. And second, I would like to know all existing burn pits that are members of the military being exposed to today, because that would be of great concern.
I'll get with SOCOM. I'll provide that information. By policy, by DOD directive, we only will use burn pits when it's an military operational necessity. Everything else, the COCOM, the way he or she manages that waste will not be managed by open burn pits.
So have they determined that all past burn pits of the last 20 years were operationally necessary?
Can you repeat that question?
Have they already determined that the hundreds of burn pits that were used in the past were all operationally necessary?
Burn pits that were used in the past were used because when you establish a base camp in an immature theater and each service member in a deployed force is generating 10 pounds or more of waste every day, and you have 300 to 3,000, that's a lot of daily waste, and we have to manage it somehow. And in an immature theater, before you can install incinerators or contract to have it removed, burn pits were used.
Understood. And then my final question, which I think you answered, but what is the process that is currently being used by DOD and each of your services to determine whether a service member returning from deployment has been exposed to toxic fumes from burn pits during his deployment? And how and where is that information recorded? And who is given access to that information? Is it shared with the VA? And I think you answered that question in the beginning. Could you just restate the answer?
Yeah. So there are a number of ways that it's captured. We have a pre-deployment assessment and a post-deployment assessment, and that includes questions on airborne hazards, location, exposure, and in addition, we have the separation assessment, which also includes similar questions on health hazards and airborne contamination and location. And that is, the separation assessment is sent to the VA with the service member. And in addition, all of that is captured in databases that is captured under EILER.
And you believe that this data has been being captured to at least since 1999?
The airborne monitoring that I'm talking about that we did at Camp Bondsteel and other areas of Kosovo were stationary air monitors. We didn't have the current systems and databases that we have today. I mean, we were writing it down on paper and pencil, the data, back then. Now it's all captured electronically.
So can you provide for the committee what years you have environmental data for air quality in different deployments around the globe?
Sure, of course.
Thank you.
And it'd go back before 1999.
It would?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so that's excellent.
I mean,
Thank
we
you.
were doing the first Gulf War.
So we can get that information. So if we wanted to know air quality at K2, we could get air quality from K2?
If I can get air quality at K2, I should be able to, yeah.
Okay, so that's the kind of information we need because we know where there were open burn pits from testimony of our service members. And if we can get air quality from those locations, it'll make their ability for the DOD to fully understand that exposure did take place because we have that data. Thank you.
Understand.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to go back. You were saying in 1999, I'm sure that sensors have changed dramatically since then. So give me an idea. now about the training for preventative medicine personnel, about the nature of the sensors, whether or not we're considering, I know these are area sensors probably, but what's the state of the art or the state of thinking in the DoD for wearable sensors, those sorts of things, so that we can track it down to the potential exposures of an individual in a situation?
Thank you, Senator. I'll start that answer off, and then I'm going to defer to my colleagues to add a little bit more detail from their perspective. We're very interested in wearables. The reason is because our emphasis, our focus really needs to be on individual exposure monitoring. The things that I was talking about before, the data that we're capturing out of the environment.
More macro level?
There you go.
Yeah.
And so, you're going to have, 100 or 30 or more individuals, and that data, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what an individual was exposed to. And, there's kind of an old saying in science, it all matters to dose response. And if we can't figure out what the dose of the exposure was and what they were exposed to, that's very difficult to, capture their response. I'll defer to my colleagues on their preventive medicine units and how they train and the technology that they use. Over to you all.
Captain.
Thank you, Senator. We a couple different things from Navy medicine. So we're very proud of our forward deployed preventive medicine units. They are agile, expeditionary teams that have quite a robust capability. So, for example, they've got portable sampling devices that are now part of a tri-service standardized program. They support all services. In fact, they've been deployed with the Army mostly, including currently. But those devices can conduct a pretty comprehensive evaluation of soil, air, water vapor, at an individual portable level device having a static sensor. So that's a robust capability that's fairly cutting edge. With regard to wearables, one unique thing that the Navy medicine is doing with research and development, we've got some very robust submarine atmospheric monitoring, quite a robust and safe program. And R&D is looking at silicone bands wearables so that you can get individual level exposure data on a submarine. In addition to that, our research labs in Dayton have an environmental health directorate that are looking at biomarkers and other correlates translating from animal models that will help us in the future get down to individual level exposure.
Colonel, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Senator. And for the Department of the Air Force, it's very similar. We're looking into to wearables. We haven't instituted them yet, but they're in development.
Dr. Mirza?
Senator, thank you for the opportunity. Myself, like my colleagues, we are also very interested in wearable technology. I think it's also important to underscore that the Army Preventive Medicine detachments are quite skilled and equipped to conduct the ambient sampling that they do as part of the missions when they're forward deploy. Certainly, air quality is not the exclusive issue of concern, as well as other environmental issues such as vector-borne diseases, pest control management, communicable diseases, and they are equipped and trained in that respect with environmental engineers, scientists, and also complementary clinical staff in public health and preventive medicine that are able to provide adjunctive and consultative support on site. And not only within the PM community, but also for all providers that are downrange. Mm-hmm. And so it's a pretty synchronized and robust capability that the Army provides in a contingency operation to assess exposures and respond to them.
I think one of the reasons why we should focus so much on wearables is we get an atomic view of exposures, and then hopefully, as a part of the process, that's being captured in the electronic health record of the individual service member and ultimately being transferred to the electronic health record for the veteran now that we have a joint office for the Cerner implementation for the VA electronic health record. I think it's going to be very important to have a seamless transition. And then hopefully we get to a point, if you're able to capture enough data, to where we can apply predictive analytics to maybe identify an exposure long before any symptoms have manifested themselves. Dr. Roach, did you have something to add?
Well, I would also add, Senator, in addition to wearables, we need to understand more about how the individual responds to environmental exposures. What risk do they bring? Other background lifestyle factors, such as, are you smoking a pack a day, before you deploy? Other lifestyle factors, or even what genetic background individuals bring. We need to understand those because they're going to have an impact. And science isn't there yet, but we're pursuing it. Over.
Thank you. Senator Hawley?
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Dr. Roush, if I could just start with you. You testified in your written testimony that since 2001, over 4 million now veterans, as well as DoD civilians and DoD contractors deployed to the Southwest Asia Theater of Operations. How many of these individuals would have been exposed to airborne hazards, including toxic exposures from burn pits, do you know, in that time frame?
Well, I can't imagine that all of them should have been exposed to some types of airborne hazards if they were deployed in various base camps and environments in Southwest Asia. Because Southwest Asia, just the military operational environment, vehicles, burn pits, everything else, to include sandstorms, create a lot of potential for airborne hazards. And if you're there, you're exposed to it.
What is DoD's estimate for the number of individuals who would qualify for the presumption of service-related connection, given how many individuals were exposed and so on?
I got to take that for the record. I'll get you as much detail as I can, but I can't give that to you off the top of my head, Senator.
That's fine. We'll take it for the record, and I'll look forward to your answer. What was the practice of burn pits in other theaters during this period of time from 2001 forward? Do you know, Dr. Roush? Besides that is Southwest Asia.
What other burn pits and other combatant commands? Mm-hmm. I'll take it for the record. Most of them should have been in the CENTCOM AOR, though.
Okay. And, well, so if they're in the CENTCOM AOR, then they're in this same region that we've been talking about, roughly. Tell me about just the DoD's collection of this data. I mean, what we're dealing with service members' exposure to toxins, burn pit toxins, other airbornes. It seems like we have very limited data for a lot of this. Why is that? Why is it the DoD has not collected this kind of data for so long? Can you give me any insight?
Well, I think we've always improved the extent of the data and the technologies that we collect the data with, and we continue to improve. We collect a lot of environmental health assessment data. A number of compounds a number of airborne compounds, particulate matter, compounds that are in the motor pool over there, the compounds in the soil that get aerosolized as a result of operations. A lot of that is collected, and it goes into a database that we call DOORS, and DOORS is a large database that can then feed into EILER, which is what I was talking about, which is an individual longitudinal exposure record that pinpoints the location of the service member with all of that environmental data, and therefore the healthcare provider can take a look and get kind of a summary of where the service member was, what the environmental hazards were in that area, and can best, form a treatment regime for that service member.
What about data available for assessing the linkages between exposure that we've been talking about to airborne toxins, including particularly from burn pits and certain kinds of illnesses. What has DoD been doing to improve data collection on that score and data analysis?
Well, so it's a part of the data that we already collect by preventive medicine units and store in our databases, but linking those exposures to illnesses has been somewhat challenging. A couple of years ago, the National Academy of Sciences said that there's consistent data from exposures in Southwest Asia to our deployed force and illnesses such as persistent cough, asthma, and a few other respiratory disorders. More data is needed, and more specific data linking individuals to certain airborne hazards and their health outcomes is needed to be able to expand that list.
I'll circle back to you on the questions for the record. I'll probably have a few more as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just a couple of follow-ups. Senator Gillibrand went to vote. She's probably waiting on the second vote to be called. So I'm kind of curious about when ILR will be fully interoperable with DOD's electronic health record and the VA's electronic health record. What's the timeline?
Yeah, the timeline for full capability is 2023. But it is capable now to
That's with
a little bit less limited.
With the DOD electronic health record, because I guess the VA electronic health record is in a multi-year implementation, so that wouldn't be, probably would have to track along with their ultimate build-out.
That's my understanding,
Okay.
yes.
Tell me a little bit about DOD-funded research on taking the information that we have about potentially toxic exposures and making certain presumptions about how that exposure could have caused a bad outcome for a service member.
Sure.
So-called presumptions.
Sure. So with regard to human studies, most of the human studies, human research that we sponsor and continue to sponsor really compares a group of deployers to a control group of non-deployers to take a look at location, environmental health assessments, what were the threats over there, and then look at the differences in terms of the incidence of health outcomes between the deployed force in that area and the control that were non-deployers. In addition to that, we also have experiments. We have animal experiments at the Air Force at Wright-Patt up at the 711th, which are looking at exposure to experimental animals of different airborne hazards to include compounds that you would see in burn pits versus and also airborne sand and dust that you would see in that deployed environment, and looking at the health effects, outcomes in experimental animals. Those are just a few. If my colleagues want to add anything, please do.
Captain.
Thank you, Senator. I'm aware of a lot of work by the Navy Medical Research Command and the Naval Health Research Center, which is based in San Diego. They've got, in addition to collaborating with the VA on these studies, they've got a Millennium Cohort, which is a powerful source of an extremely large population that's allowing them to explore all of these questions. I will defer to my colleagues before getting into specifics, but thank you.
Yeah, we already, thank you, Senator. We already know that there's a lot of medical symptoms and diseases that are associated with open burn pits and other airborne toxins, but it's difficult to find a direct link to those at this time. But there is many studies that are underway that are looking into that, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to link that. I think the important thing with the EILER is the EILER captures the data, it links it to the individual. It also captures data from when the individual returns from deployment, and it asks them specifically if they have any symptoms or have any concerns with airborne hazards or chemicals. And so if they answer that to the affirmative, there's always a provider that's gonna talk to them one-on-one and address that with them. They also have a post-deployment health assessment that occurs 90 to 180 days after they get back, and it's the same questions. They ask them, do you have any symptoms or any concerns you have with airborne hazards and chemicals, and once again, if those are answered in the affirmative, then the provider gets with them and they talk to them. Again, during the preventative health assessment, that specifically goes into those questions again, and this is something that every member of the Department of Air Force gets annually. They ask the same questions, and they also go into the open burn pit registry. They encourage all members to register for that if they've been in a deployed area with an open burn pit. Even if they don't have any symptoms or any concerns, they're encouraged to go ahead and register for that. And once again, a provider will reach back and talk with them and go over any questions or concerns that they might have.
Dr. Mercer?
Thank you, Senator. In our organization at the Army Public Health Center, we've engaged in several epidemiological studies. And in those studies, we essentially use deployment history as a proxy for exposures. And so, of course, that can include exposures to burn pits, but also to the poor air quality conditions within the area of operations. And we also take that information and we look at the health status of those individuals before they deployed and after they deployed to make determinations about whether or not associations existed for particular respiratory disorders of interest. What we have found is that these epidemiological studies are not always very conclusive, and a lot of that has to do with limitations of the study because we don't necessarily have individualized exposure information tied to individuals and their health outcomes. That's a significant limitations. But what we do have the strongest evidence to suggest is that respiratory symptoms are present in many deployers into the CENTCOM area of operations as a function of the air quality issues that are there. So those symptoms are like shortness of breath, cough, phlegm production, decrements in their ability to successfully pass their physical performance tests and things of that nature. And so we have that information. Other studies that have been conducted have been looking at deployers themselves and looking at them prospectively, how they have been managed clinically and what conditions they have suffered as a consequence of their deployment, particularly looking at respiratory conditions. A small study that was conducted looked at those particular deployers and determined about half of those individuals didn't have necessarily diagnosable respiratory conditions per se, despite the fact that they had symptoms that they complained about. But the other half seemed to have symptoms consistent with asthma and hyperreactivity of the airway and such. And so the bottom line is there's been a lot of studying occurring about deployers and their respiratory health and the potential associations that exist with their deployment. But based on limitations on exposure data, it's very difficult to make strong conclusions about the source of exposure and those health outcomes.
Thank you.
The department's prepared statement for this hearing states that peer-reviewed published research documents that military personnel deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan appear to experience elevated rates of acute upper respiratory symptoms during deployment and may be at greater risk for post-deployment respiratory symptoms and respiratory illnesses. Dr. Mirza, Dr. Newell, and Dr. Feldman, please describe what your service does to ensure that service members concerned about potential health effects of exposure to airborne hazards receive appropriate health care. And is this care documented in their health records, and will this information be available to the VA when the service member leaves service and receives care through the VA?
Senator, thank you for that question. I'll walk you through essentially a process that we undertake. First, when individuals are in deployed environment and they are suffering with any respiratory illness, rather, let me take a step back, any illness or any symptoms. We have medical personnel, we have medical centers that are deployed, or MTFs that are deployed there with appropriate personnel to respond to those concerns. Those get documented and are available throughout the course of that service member's service treatment record to be looked at prospectively. When these individuals redeploy, they come back home. They undergo post-deployment health assessment, and there's essentially two parts to that. One is a screening questionnaire in which these individuals self-report concerns about their health, their respiratory symptoms, and other organ-associated symptomatology of interest. And we also ask about their concerns about environmental exposures, a whole scope of exposures, not necessarily airborne, but chemical and so on. Once they complete that self-assessment, these individuals then are evaluated by a provider, and they're given that option for a focused medical evaluation based on any concerns that they have advocated for on that self-assessment. Routinely, we conduct periodic health assessments. This has a couple purposes. The first is to assure that individuals are assessed annually, that they maintain the medical standards and a certain level of physical fitness to be able to do their job. The second is to also identify any health outcomes or health issues of personal concern that need to be evaluated and managed further, either by a primary care provider or a specialist that is going to be referred in for their care. But also, as a function of that periodic health assessment, it's an additional opportunity to ascertain any personal concerns that individual may have about exposures within the environment which they operate, soldier, or deploy to. And so, essentially, there are three main points of care, in my view, in which these individuals are evaluated: is downrange, if they're experiencing symptoms. It's when they return home as a function of the post-deployment health assessment process, and it's also at least annually on a periodic basis when they're going through a periodic health assessment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'll tag on. Very analogous and identical processes as we're very joint on this. Some highlights in the Navy, for example, forward deployed, I mentioned while you're out, we have some forward deployed prevent units that are the first on the ground whenever any force deploys. And what they do is conduct a survey. It's pretty comprehensive, over 22 items of everything from the environment, vectors, chemical, nuclear risk, radiation, and provide that information to the combatant commander so that they can make an informed decision on what the risk is, know what the preventative and mitigation measures are, and maximize or minimize the risk of force. That information is captured in these OESHAs we talked about, the Occupational Environmental Health Surveys. Those feed a process reviewed by Dr. Roush called fumes, periodic occupational environmental surveys. It's an iterative process. The more data we get, the more it feeds those reports so that we can get a more comprehensive view of what the population risks are until we get mature with individuals. So that information comes back as these deployers come home with both their pre- and post-deployment surveys and their periodic health assessments, and we have specific questions that are verbally reviewed on those questionnaires to ensure that a dialogue happens with the clinician. Do you know you were exposed to a location that's in a registry? If those clinicians don't have the expertise in their primary care, each MTF and all our overseas MTFs have specially trained clinicians, occupational environmental medical specialists like Dr. Mirza, environmental health specialists, industrial health hygiene specialists, who consult with those clinicians that are available. In addition to that, my command, and that was to the Army and Navy Marine Corps Public Health Center, are another layer of consultative expertise for those specific questions that when a patient comes to a clinic visit, has that concern, those are the resources that Navy Medicine has to help optimize the care of that individual patient.
Yep. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I agree with my colleagues. I'll just add on that the ILR does report those specific questions that we ask about airborne hazards, and so it pulls that. So not only are you looking at the occupational environmental health risk assessments of when the member was downrange multiple times, and you're reviewing those exposures, it's taking those little bit of questions that the member has answered regarding airborne hazards from the post-deployment health assessment and the periodic health assessment. And we also have a new separation health assessment that's been under development for the last year. It should be released this fall, and it also goes into detail about airborne hazards and chemicals of that nature, and that will also be documented.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Just one. I just want to echo Senator Gillibrand or reemphasize Senator Gillibrand on current active burn pits, some of the process that led to these being operationally necessary, I think would be very helpful for the committee. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I welcome the second panel to come up. Thank you very much. I now welcome the second panel, Dr. Anthony M. Siesma, Director, International Center of Excellence in Deployment, Health, and Medical Geosciences, Northwell Health Foundation. Mr. Tom Porter, Executive Vice President for Government Affairs, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Mrs. Rosie Torres, Executive Director, Burn Pits 360, and Mr. Stephen Patterson, former Environmental Science Officer, Combined Joint Task Force 101 Headquarters, Afghanistan from 2008 to 2009. Thank you so much, and each of you can give your opening statements. Dr. Siesma, you can go. Dr. Siesma, you can go first.
Thank you, Chair Gillibrand, Ranking Member Tillis, members of the Personnel Subcommittee of the Senate for Armed Services Committee for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. Between 1998 and 2015, I was Allergy Section Chief, Veterans Affairs Medical Center, Northport, New York. And my expertise on this issue stems from the following. My team first reported new onset asthma among soldiers deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan with exposure to burn pits in 2007. We described deployment-related rhinitis in 2008, coined the term Iraq Afghanistan War Lung Injury, IAWLI, in 2011 based on lung function testing data, developed animal models with burn pit-based dust in 2014, tested candidate drugs in these mice in 2018, and co-invented new candidate medicines this year. I am testifying because, as a physician, I care about the health and well-being of my patients who are our soldiers. The team in my office sees numerous patients post-deployment with a variety of symptoms, which includes shortness of breath, cough, and chest pain, which is accentuated with exercise. I have diagnosed post-burn pit exposed soldiers with asthma, non-smoking related accelerated COPD, constrictive bronchiolitis, carbonaceous burned lung, titanium lung, lung fibrosis, bladder cancer, and pulmonary ossification or bone in the lung. In one severe case, for example, one of my patients with lung fibrosis underwent 2 lung transplants. He just died in December. As an expert in the field, I've concluded that these lung disorders are directly related to exposure to airborne hazards, including burn pits, dust storms, improvised explosive devices, and blast overpressure from mortar-fired rounds. As doctors treating these patients, one challenge we face is that there's inadequate screening of these military personnel who are predisposed to lung injury. Lack of screening means they never get diagnosed, they get diagnosed late, or they get diagnosed when it's irreversible. The dilemma with military personnel who typically do not have asthma, who pass basic training outdoors, who must be fit for deployment at Fort Hood, is that they do not have pre-deployment pulmonary assessments, unlike the Fire Department of New York, which was able to determine lung function reduction after 9/11. An otherwise healthy soldier who's 100% predicted pre-deployment, who goes down to 80%, has a significant decrease. Another challenge we face is that doctors treating these service members is the lack of information we receive. Without knowing what they're exposed to or potentially exposed to, it's hard to prove what caused the ailment. For example, last month, one patient of mine was denied a consult to the East Orange War-Related Illness and Injury Center because the local VA doctor said he did not believe that military firefighters' sleep apnea, sinusitis, asthma, and rhinitis were related to deployment, even though he had a positive sleep study during active service. Even if it is known that there are toxic materials at certain sites, often soldiers visit our academic center without complete documentation of locations of their deployment, so their direct exposure cannot be proven. This is especially the case if they were at forward operating bases like Camp Stryker, whose exact location is not on the map. I have several recommendations to address these challenges and ensure we are taking care of our service members. 1, conduct breathing tests before and after deployment. 2, revamp the DoD method of documenting locations where military personnel served. 3, utilize newer technology such as wearable particle monitors. First, by conducting breathing tests before and after deployment, we can determine if there's a reduction in lung function much earlier than if we wait. In addition, these data will better enable screening protocols to identify who are soldiers at risk. Second, by revamping the DoD method of documenting locations where military personnel serve, we'll have a better understanding of what they're exposed to, a better understanding of the illness, and how to treat it. Third, by utilizing newer technology such as wearable particle monitors with GPS, we'll be able to assess a given soldier's exposure and location. By utilizing this for contingent and military personnel, the DoD will be better able to move troops to regions of safety away from airborne hazards. If exposure does happen, it would also provide critical information for treatment. We know that screening and monitoring programs have been extremely effective for those victims of the World Trade Center disaster post 9/11. And this is an analogous exposure with JP8 and burn pits. It is our sacred duty to care for the women and men who sacrifice their lives for our freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Siesma. Mr. Porter.
Thank you for having us here, Senator Gillibrand and Senator Tillis. Appreciate everything that you're doing on this issue. I'd like to introduce my daughter, 13-year-old daughter here at Elizabeth Porter. She's playing hooky from school today, so hopefully she gets something out of this. I also want to, on a more serious note, I want to take this opportunity to say that my thoughts and prayers are with Dr. Kate Hendricks-Thomas, advocate on this issue. She's going through a very particularly tough time with regard to her burn pit-related illness. So I'm here not only as an IAVA advocate, but as one who was exposed to a variety of airborne toxins from burn pits and other sources while I was deployed. Before I went downrange, I had completely healthy lungs. Shortly after I arrived in Kabul in 2010, where the air is particularly bad, my lungs had a severe reaction and became infected. It was controlled with medication, but I was diagnosed with asthma as soon as I got back home a year later. But I have to still take the medications to keep my breathing to keep breathing. Exposure to burn pits used by military to destroy medical, human waste, chemicals, petroleum, other trash. It's been widespread. We've talked about this a lot here already. It's not just burn pits. You could learn a lot from those who have served in Kabul, for example. It's an enormous city without a modern sewage system. Many who served there are suffering the impacts from breathing airborne feces for extended periods of time. And there are also burn pits there at many of the bases in that city alone. At every location where U.S. and coalition military were stationed, there were many porta-johns. It was somebody's job to pull out that metal bin from the porta-john every day, douse it with jet fuel, and burn it down to a brick. And that's how you get rid of the porta-john waste. And it's somebody's job to do that. And I don't need to describe that. That's particularly a nasty job. The military and veteran community know all too well the detrimental, how detrimental these toxic exposures can be. I'll refer to our new member survey that's just out this month. For 2022, we survey our members. 82% of our members say they experienced toxic exposures during their service. Of those, 90% say they have or may have symptoms as a result. Of the 82% who were exposed, just 53% said they had their exposures documented in their DoD periodic health assessments. So just 53%. This data shows the enormous percentage of those who are suffering service-related exposures, especially considering the estimate the VA has of as many as 3.5 million that could have been exposed. When IAVA saw similar data in a previous member survey, we conceived of and worked hard to pass the Burn Pits Accountability Act that was passed in 2020 within the NDAA. So this would, the law required service members to be evaluated for exposures during routine health exams. Service members were required to be enrolled in the Burn Pit Registry unless they opt out, if they suffered exposures or if they were stationed near a burn pit. 76% of IAVA members were aware of the registry, but only 59% are registered in it. DoD must maximize its efforts to ensure all who are eligible get enrolled, not just informed of it as the law requires. It requires them to be enrolled in the registry. And that's the intent behind the law in the first place. And we know this because we worked to develop the bill and pass it. IAVA would like DoD to confirm if the letter and intent of the Burn Pits Accountability Act is being executed, including whether service members are actually being required to enroll in the registry or simply being advised of its existence. We heard a lot of talk already today about the EILER database. That's really critical, we believe. It would help inform service members, veterans, and the medical providers of the exposures by your location and time you were deployed. I think we heard that it was supposed to be operational in 2023, September 2023 is what I understand. We supported legislation that required that veterans have access to their EILER database online. So hopefully that stays on track for implementation by September 2023, and we'd like your assistance to try to ensure that that happens. There's also been some talk in the news about the Red Hill fuel storage facility in Hawaii. This is another toxic exposure, so it's not all burn pits. We want to make sure that the DoD documents those exposures to not only the service members that are serving there now but have been dislocated, but then also those that have been impacted over the life of the fuel storage facility. That's important. How are they going to be doing that? Serving in the military is tough on one's body. I don't think that's surprising to anybody here. Although not specific to toxic exposures, a significant indicator of IAVA members' health when asked in our member survey how they would rate their overall health before joining the military, 91% rated their health as excellent or good. When asked how they rated their health after they left the military, just 33% said it was excellent or good. The military service can be hard and cause adverse health impacts. It's not a surprise. But those who may want to encourage their sons and daughters to enter the military expect that if one does suffer injuries, our government will care for them when they come home. Failure to care for the many who suffered toxic exposures may diminish the value of military service in the public's eyes. And by refusing to satisfy our obligations to them, we communicate to current and future service members that we do not actually have their backs. So on behalf of the 3.5 million service members and veterans who may have suffered toxic exposures, I implore you to ensure that DoD follows recently enacted laws meant to increase transparency and information sharing with those who have suffered exposures and to spare no effort in not only anticipating new hazards our personnel may encounter, but advise them of their known risks ahead of time so they and medical professionals are better equipped to address emergent health impacts. Again, thank you very much for having me today, and happy to answer any questions.
Mrs. Torres. Yes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Gillibrand, Ranking Member Tillis, and members of the subcommittee for today's hearing and for this opportunity to testify. It seems like yesterday when some members of Congress believed that the health risks of toxic exposures in burn pits were based on anecdotal evidence. While we have data today that shows otherwise, I'm here to tell you personally about the stories of the men and women who bravely defended our country, exposed to toxic chemicals that for many cost them their life. My story begins with my husband, retired Captain Leroy Torres, who served as a Texas State Trooper for 14 years and as a soldier for 23 years before being medically retired. He deployed to Balad, Iraq from 2007 to 2008, where he was exposed to the largest burn pit within the Operation Iraqi Freedom Theater of Operations, which was the size of approximately a football field. He lived and worked next to the toxic plume of black smoke that infiltrated where they lived, ate, and slept. He returned home from war to face a healthcare system that failed him and an employer too afraid to understand an uncommon war injury resulting in termination of his law enforcement career. As a result of these injustices, Leroy attempted to end his life in 2016. Since returning from Iraq, he's had over 400 medical visits until he was finally diagnosed with autoimmune disease, toxic brain injury, and constrictive bronchiolitis following a lung biopsy at Vanderbilt University. The VA and DoD refuse to recognize or diagnose these environmental injuries, often misdiagnosing them as psychosomatic or dismissing them as compensation-driven care seeking. The more veterans we talked to, the more we heard about stories like Leroy's. This is why 12 years ago, Leroy and I co-founded Burn Pits 360, a nonprofit that advocates for veterans, service members, and families of the fallen affected by toxic exposures. We created a health registry of about 10,000 participants to track their exposure, diseases, and deaths, working with doctors like Dr. Zema. We then joined in Washington and gathered with other families to pass the Airborne Hazards Open Burn Pit Registry Act of 2013. We've been to far too many funerals and consoled countless of wives, husbands, and children left alone by our government's failure to treat our nation's veterans. Burn Pits 360 has persevered through the years despite the indifference of the VA, DoD, and Congress. Instead of providing them with treatment, early cancer diagnostics, and benefits, our government spent the last years telling veterans there's no evidence that inhaling toxic black smoke causes respiratory illnesses and cancers, that their stories are anecdotes and not data, and that treating them is too costly. I cannot help but wonder, what is the cost of their lives and sacrifice? So now more than ever, we need to pass legislation that addresses presumption. The time is well past due for the President, the Department of Defense, Veteran Affairs to acknowledge these injuries and disease as a direct result of armed conflict or caused by an instrumentality of war. We are asking for the Department of Defense and Veteran Affairs to honor these injuries with compassionate common sense. This is an invitation to begin the healing process for these families who have lost loved ones to illness or death following the environmental hardships of war. Yet Leroy's story is not the only one. Sergeant Thomas Joseph Sullivan served with the United States Marine in Iraq. He suffered from intestinal ulcerations and bleeding, hypertension, respiratory disease, asthma, and liver disorder. Tom died 2009 at 30 years old. Will Thompson served with the U.S. Army for 23 years and was deployed twice to Iraq. His doctors treated his cough as allergies. He was later diagnosed with pneumonia, treated with antibiotics, and sent home. Eventually, he was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis. After a lung biopsy, he was informed that he had titanium, magnesium, iron, and silica in his lungs. Will underwent 2 transplants and passed away this December at 50 years old. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Brewer, CENTCOM environmental officer, deployed to Afghanistan and warned his supervisors about the health effects of the black fumes caused by burning of waste and plastic at night. Lastly, Isaiah James served with the U.S. Army, deployed to Iraq 2006, 2008, 2008 to 2009, and Afghanistan 2010 to 2011. And Isaiah says this: he is now suffering from lung disease and is on supplemental oxygen. He says, "It is my hope you not only listen to the testimony, but to hear it, to feel it, to understand it, and most importantly, to act on it. History is the ultimate judge, and we in this country have not always done best by those who we sent in our stead. I believe it was Churchill who said, "Never has so much been owed to so few by so many. How will you be judged, and how will America and the American people pay their debt?"
Senators, thank you for this opportunity. I'm Stephen Patterson, retired environmental science and engineering officer. This falls into the larger preventive medicine community that was mentioned earlier. I'm here today to assist you with your understanding of burn pits, environmental health exposures, and how those were documented. Primarily, I can speak to the time of 2008 and 2009 when I was a senior environmental science officer for Combined Joint Task Force 101 while it was the headquarters for Afghanistan. In this position, I traveled the nation extensively and saw most of the locations where U.S. forces were deployed. My job was to conserve the fighting force and identify environmental health exposures. The deployed environment is very challenging and is very difficult to document a person's exposures in such a setting. The equipment to identify and quantify exposures is often lacking, as are trained personnel, especially in remote locations. This is made more difficult as we often have exposures which one would not anticipate, as well as the challenge of accurately placing a certain person in a location at a given time. This is made worse when attempting to look back 10 or 20 years, as camp names often change and the personnel system does not operate down to the person. Almost all the locations I visited had burn pits operating at that time, and few, if any, separated their waste before burning it. So many contained pressurized lumber, galvanized metal, significant quantities of plastics, and lithium batteries. These were not pits, but simply low-lying areas where the waste was thrown and burned. Typically, they smoldered a great deal, which is important as the combustion is not complete. More toxic compounds may form, and these toxins are not lifted away, so stay near or in the air around the camp. Most of these burn pits were within the perimeter fence for security reasons or very close to the perimeter if outside of the camp. Most of those small camps had few, if any, air samples taken at them due to limited personnel, equipment, transportation challenges, and time. We had roughly 20 people to attempt to document the environmental exposures of over 37,000 people spread over an area roughly the size of Texas. However, I do not think more environmental health people are the ideal solution. The limited environmental health data, mostly air samples with some soil and water samples, cannot be linked to a person but only to a location. And even if the person can confirm that they were at that location, it does not mean they had that exposure. Their exposures could have been much worse or much better than the sample indicated. The DoD has this responsibility and must address it, as industry will likely not do so, as they do not face these particular challenges. We have struggled in this space since Desert Storm, and we must look at different options moving forward. We must leverage technology and address policy issues to fix these gaps. Some possible options to consider: creation of a joint program executive office in order to focus the research and funding on environmental health surveillance while also providing a central location to hold responsible in the future. 2, silicone bracelets could be provided to service members to track their exposures, as mentioned earlier. These have been shown to capture more than 1,500 different chemical compounds and would allow us to mitigate exposures much sooner while also providing a service member with personal exposure data. 3, research and build a replacement for the silicone bracelet, which will provide near real-time information on exposure and dose for a service member. 4, create a repository of frozen soil samples from each deployment location so they may be tested in the future as needed when new concerns are identified. 5, improve the personnel reporting system so that each individual can be located rather than their unit headquarters, which may be hundreds of miles away from them. This will allow for individual exposures to be much more accurately documented. 6, remote sensing should be researched to address gaps in environmental surveillance. This will be key for small teams operating in remote areas or dense urban environments, which may never have an environmental health professional visit them. 7, further research biomarker monitoring to document exposures a person had during their deployment or over their military career. Finally, 8, educate leaders on the hazards of toxic exposures and hold them responsible if they needlessly expose their people. Thank you for your time. Open to any questions.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
Thank you all for being here. I guess you heard the testimony. I think most of you were in the room during the first panel. It sounds as if there is consensus on one of the questions that I brought up were individualized monitoring and sensors. But speaking for active duty, Ms. Torres, I do a lot of work. I serve on the VA committee. We've got a lot of work to do, and we're making progress. And again, I want to give Senator Gillibrand credit for focusing on that issue. We're going to make more progress there. I'm sorry for the situation with your husband and for the others that you mentioned. But with respect to what we need to do better upstream, how would you judge the DOD in making a priority, the priorities that you all have delineated in your opening comments? Where are they falling short?
My team applied for congressionally directed medical.
You need red means on. It's weird, but.
My team applied for a congressionally directed medical research program grant funded by the DoD recently, months ago. We got a great score. This was for a monitor the size of a beeper that a soldier could wear. It would not only measure particulate matter, but even sarin gas specifically and gunshot sounds. And despite a good score, they said there are no funds. So I don't know why they're asking us to apply for grants if there's no money.
Well, that's a question we can get to the bottom of.
Thank you, Senator. One of the biggest things that, and I mentioned it in the testimony, but one of the biggest problems is we've experienced a big lack of transparency from federal agencies on what people were exposed to and on their deployments. That's the big thing, and I think the ILR is meant to tackle that. It's just a matter of is it going to be useful to the service member and to the veteran? That's key.
You also mentioned the idea that the registry is available, but I, for one, think that we should be in an opt-out position, that everybody should be registered in the registry. And if they want to explicitly opt out, I suppose they should, but we should probably flip the script on that. Would you agree?
Right. The burn pit registry, it's what the law requires is for them to be entered into it unless they opt not to. So it's not mandatory if you don't want to be in the registry. But the law says that if somebody is exposed or they're stationed next to a burn pit, then they should be entered into the registry.
I agree. I mean, the burn pit registry still falls short in so many ways. It's basically just self-reported data that you could print out and carry around. But it is important that everyone be a participant of that effort. You know, they don't track mortality, which is, I think, one area that we've talked about for years, Dr. Zema. But I agree, Senator Tillis, that should be mandated.
Mr. Patterson.
Well, Senator, there's so many challenges in this space. The previous individuals talking, so much of it is self-reported. So a 20-year-old individual returns from overseas, and you ask them what happened to him over 15 months. And that's just, and not to mention the fact that that individual they're not going to be able to say I was exposed to TCE or benzene or toluene. Just some bad stuff happened to me. There was a lot of smoke. They can't say anything that is going to help that clinician when they end up in the VA system. So much of what is being done now is just not terribly effective.
No, that's why I get to the need for us to get down to the atomic level sooner rather than later. That's the only way we're really going to be able to capture it and then have the level of specificity with respect to the specific exposures. So I agree with you all. We're coming up on the end of a vote. I thank you all for being here. I also appreciate your opening testimony. There were a lot of priorities put in there, and they'll be instructive to me as we move forward. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Torres, first of all, I want to thank you for your advocacy on behalf of service members, veterans, and their families who have suffered debilitating injuries and effects of burn pits. What is the top challenge that you hear from soldiers when they return from deployment about accessing treatment?
Well, first of all, Senator, thank you for having me. Lots of challenges. You know, that question just brings up so many ideas in my mind of things that we've tracked through our own in a private registry. And off the top of my head, it's, you know, access to healthcare monitoring, specialized healthcare, both on the DoD and VA side, but primarily DoD, for those active service members, for those reservists, it's a challenge when they don't have trained occupational medicine doctors assessing these underlying issues. And then secondly is filing for presumption for these illnesses that are underlying, right? So if you don't have the specialized health care, how can they properly transition them through the compensation and disability process?
Right. Well, thank you. What information or resources would be most helpful to the service members you work with when they return from deployment to ensure they're getting the screening and treatment they need?
I think, definitely mandating that the clinicians be trained, and I think Dr. Zema can help me here, but absolutely having every clinician, every nurse trained in the area of airborne hazards, documenting in the record, in the electronic health record on the VA and DoD side, that they are identified as having had undergone some type of exposure. And, to say the least, I've had this conversation recently with many people about even just something as small as signage, right? Like during the World Trade Center, there was communication and outreach and signage on if you're experiencing these issues. People are having to access care through people like Dr. Zema, and they have to fly to New York and fly to Vanderbilt and fly and exhaust their life savings like our family did. That shouldn't be happening in America. And so we need to start, and we need to start now.
Thank you very much. Mr. Porter, thank you for sharing the survey results of your members. Why do you think only 59% of IAVA members are registered in the burn pits registry? Dr. Roush testified as to some of the steps the DoD is taking to increase participation in the registry. Have you seen an increase in those registered over the years among your members? And what do you think can be done to better encourage more service members and veterans to participate?
Thank you for the question. This came up when we developed the Burn Pits Accountability Act a few years ago, because if you look on the VA website, it has a running total of those that are registered in it. And at the time when we looked at it back in 2017, there were only 140,000 entries into the registry. I think it's probably double that now. I haven't looked recently yet, but it was only 140,000, and that's out of, again, VA's estimate is as many as 3.5 million have been exposed. So for only 140,000, that presented a big challenge. I think that the main problem with that was that reason for that is because hardly anybody knows about the registry. Mm-hmm. So through the passage of that bill, we talked about it a lot, and we put it out a lot of social media on that. And we've also encouraged the VA to do more about that to get the word out to veterans that this registry is here, and then why somebody should be in it. You get, I understand, a free health exam if you're in the system. But again, it's not qualifying somebody for a presumption. I think there's a misunderstanding there too. The veterans should apply for their disability, and they're getting turned down about 3/4 of the people that apply.
You testified that if the EILER system's done right, service members and veterans will have significant transparency into their exposure. What does done right mean to you, and what are the critical components of EILER that must be implemented to make a difference in the care service members and veterans receive?
Well, what right looks like is if somebody was deployed to Balad, Iraq in 2006, then that EILER should be able to give them the data from what they were probably exposed to in 2006 in Balad. Same thing with me. I traveled around Afghanistan all over the place, so it really couldn't be pinpoint to one location. So that just shows how complex it was. So I traveled around the whole country frequently. So it'd be harder for that. But again, it should specify what you're exposed to during your deployment during a set period of time.
Now I'm going to turn it over to Senator Warren, and she's going to chair the meeting while I go vote.
So thank you. We're tag teaming here. I voted early so that I could be here while the chairwoman goes to vote. And I want to say publicly a big thank you to the chairwoman for holding this hearing. I think it's really important. I think it's important that this committee look at the real costs of war, including where the Department of Defense failed to take steps that were necessary to prevent exposing members of the military to toxic chemicals. I know that many of our witnesses on this panel have been fighting for over a decade for DOD and the VA to recognize how burn pit exposure has had devastating effects on service members' lives. Now, I know that there's some debate over the data, but it's just common sense that these toxins would cause significant problems to human beings. And it's important for DOD to continue to study this issue, to improve our understanding of the science, but we can't keep waiting for action. We need to take care of our veterans now, not later, now. I know that the focus of today's hearing is DOD's role in determining eligibility for care, not the VA's, but we also have to consider the toll of this entire process on families. So, Ms. Torres, if you don't mind, I'd like to be able to ask you about your experiences. I read your testimony. I understand about how hard you've had to fight, how long you have had to fight to get the care that your husband deserves and that other veterans deserve. So if I can, let me just ask you a little bit about how this process makes your family feel.
Thank you so much for that question. It's been a journey, a hellish journey of delay and deny, not just for myself, the Torres family, but for thousands, possibly millions of families. It feels, I know for my husband, being stripped of his integrity and dignity, losing his job, being on the brink of foreclosure, repossession of cars, and you ask yourself, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. And how is this happening in America's backyard? It feels as if the nation has turned its back when you're, attempting to just access care. We attempted to access care from both DOD and VA healthcare institutions, and throughout those 10 years, it was always an excuse of there's no science, there's no proof. And so myself, including, I know many families, maybe to include yours, Tom, is that we have to exhaust our life savings just to access doctors like Dr. Anthony Zema, like Dr. Robert Miller, like the doctors over at National Jewish, being away from our children. That's time lost that I'll never get back. And so not only, does it impact the veteran and the spouse, but the children. And so, to still, to this day, to finally see some momentum as we're seeing now, it really gives us hope.
Well, I'm glad to hear you in that on hope, but when you say you feel as if our government, our country, has turned its back on you and your family and thousands, maybe millions of families in the same position, no veteran should feel that way, and no family of a veteran should feel that way. You have done a tremendous amount of advocacy related to changing the rules for how veterans must prove they were impacted by burn pits in order to get care. I support you in your work on this. I know it is a hard and lonely journey, but you have done remarkable work here. So let me see if I can turn this around just a little bit. Ms. Torres, what would it mean to you and other veterans' families if the rules were changed so that the DOD and the VA believed veterans when they said their health was harmed by burn pits, rather than making them jump through so many hoops?
Well, it would remove the burden of proof of us having to be our own lawyers, our own researchers, our own, all of those things that we've become, right? We've sort of, mobilized and congregated online all sharing that common denominator of delay and deny. So to finally see, historic legislation passed so that we don't have to be all those things, so that the Gold Star spouses that call us weekly expressing how heart-wrenching it is for them to spend the last moments of their loved one's life gathering buddy statements and evidence when they should be holding the hand and embracing their loved one. It would mean everything to us and to those families that are still struggling to this day, and for those still waiting on an answer from the VA.
Well, as I said, I commend you for your advocacy work here. It at least helps us start to move in the right direction. And I appreciate that making a change like this is not inexpensive. There's a lot of money at stake here. And I also understand it is not all in the jurisdiction of this committee. But it is urgent that we treat families, we treat those who are injured without delay. We cannot allow veterans to wait another minute for health care. And so I hope that the work we do here today will help put more momentum behind change. This committee regularly advocates for spending on weapons that don't work or weapons that are not needed at all. It is inexcusable to claim that we need to balance the budget on the backs of veterans and their families who've been injured. So I hope that what comes out of our work today is that we can give a stronger push on that. If I can, I've got a few more questions here, questions that the chair also wanted me to ask. Mr. Patterson, if I could ask you about the advances in technology that have been made and can be made to improve the way that troops' toxic exposure can be documented. Could you say a bit about that, please?
Well, thank you, Senator. As far as advances since Desert Storm, sadly, it's not been very significant. We replaced the mini-vol with a different type of deployable particulate matter sampler, but there's still significant challenges. Those samplers simply capture the particulate matter that's in the air, and then you can send it to a lab, and many months later, get a report back of what was possibly in that sample. The downside of that is any volatile organic compounds are not going to be in that sample because they will have cooked off in the transportation and those months for you to get the sample back. So the progress has been extremely slow and extremely challenging. And I'm just looking at my time in from Desert Storm to Afghanistan. I made some recommendations in my testimony. I believe that the biomarkers have some significant capabilities with them. The silicone bracelets, I think, is an excellent idea because then we would be able to know much sooner. For instance, Afghanistan, we had formaldehyde-treated lumber from China that we were using to build the small buildings that the soldiers slept in. I had no reason to expect to find formaldehyde in a pristine river valley in Afghanistan. Why is that there? I have no reason to go look for that. If we had had those silicone bracelets on those individuals, we could have had them back. And there's time to this, but I would have known quickly rather than a year or two later, hey, why? What is this? And then we could have mitigated it, and I could have protected the next group of soldiers that went in there. Mm-hmm. So, and the remote sensing that I mentioned, I believe is very key moving forward when we get to, if we're going to do dispersed operations with small groups. There's a lot of atmospheric analysis that can be done with satellite imagery. It's a bit of an immature space, but if you're talking special operations units that are very small, they're never going to have a preventive medicine person visit them. So that would give you some idea. And I believe the problem with all of these things is they're not perfect, but they will further the science significantly. And we've been pushing too much for perfect rather than taking some reasonable steps forward.
And just so I can get the comparison here, can you say a little bit about when you were in Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009, how was an individual's exposure to a burn pit measured or documented?
Well, Senator, some of them were not documented at all, which is a very frustrating point for me because we were operating down into small FOBs where it might have been a platoon on a FOB, so 50 people, maybe 100 individuals. And with a staff of approximately 20 people, there was no way that I could get them out there to do that surveillance, which should have been done weekly. Ideally, you want to do it once a week, rotating, so you never repeat it on the same weekday. So some of those FOBs, I would grab a soil sample because that was all that I could do. Those air monitors take 24 hours to capture a sample properly. If you just go and take a grab, it could be very high or very low. You need the average over 24 hours. So a lot of them, there's probably little to no data in the DOORS system, which was mentioned earlier, to be able to address that soldier's concerns. The larger compounds fared better, but even then, I cannot tell you what I was exposed to in those 13 months, and this was my job. So for an individual who is ignorant of the space and thinks they're invulnerable at 20-something, they're not going to have any idea.
So let me just ask the follow-on question to that. When service members are headed home, what kind of information were they given about their exposure and what kind of risks they might be facing in the future?
It was all self-reporting that I recall.
Okay.
Sometimes some units would put something in their medical record that said you had a burn pit exposure or you had a heavy metal exposure from the location that you were in. But that was a unit by unit situation. And then as mentioned earlier, they asked this 20-year-old invincible individual, what were you exposed to? I'm fine. I don't have any problems. And they move out. Another concern is then those individuals that never end up going to the VA at all. You did your tour. You were 22 years old and bulletproof, and they never went into the VA system. Then they approached the VA 10 or 20 years later. Now they have that much of a tougher upstream fight. And the FOB, the compound names changed constantly. There's some individuals that probably, that compound no longer existed 5 years later. Quite often they changed every year. The gentleman talking about being able to link this to an individual's exposure, unless the personnel operating system is changed, that unit identification code links everybody to usually the company level. But if that company operated 3 sites with their platoons broken out to those other sites, that data is not accurate for that individual. So there's going to be a lot of challenges, and the further we go back, the more challenges there are going to be with linking people to location to exposure.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator.
Patterson. I'm going to yield back to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your testimony today. I think you have really informed the committee what we have to accomplish. I particularly appreciated the specific requests that you've made of this committee, specific changes in the law you'd like to see. The benefit of this committee is we are the personnel subcommittee, so we can write these requirements into law for this year's NDAA. And so you've given us really good information about where the system's lacking, why it's not getting the data that it needs, how we actually collect the data we really do need, what's lacking in terms of when our personnel are getting their medical exams, and what the baseline is, and what pre-deployment and post-deployment look like. I don't know if this was addressed, but did you guys discuss what is the best way to transfer the medical records from active duty service members to veteran status, and what you would like to see in that transfer of information, and what we might need to create if we don't have it.
Sure, Senator. That should work with the electronic health record reform. So when that looks right, which means a seamless transition from the DoD to the VA, and that service member or veteran can have easy access to that information.
And access to the EILER system.
Yes, ma'am.
And on that point, Senator, sorry, Tom, definitely consider making EILER accessible to the survivors. I had one survivor call me and asking assistance in communicating with VA to access EILER as she was filing for presumption or for death benefits. And it was difficult because EILER didn't date back to the time that he was in service. So lots of challenges there.
Thank you. And Dr. Siesma, you called on DoD to revamp their method of documentation so that medical professionals could have better understanding of their patients' potential exposures. What information would be most helpful to you to have as you screen and treat patients? What obstacles do you face with the patients when you are trying to gather needed information about exposure? And then further, what training do you think should be provided to medical professionals so they can better screen and treat their patients for toxic exposure?
Yeah, we would like to know which region of the country an individual soldier was in, what types of munitions they were exposed to, what the chemical makeup of the munitions were, how trash was disposed of in that region, including burn pits, what was in the trash itself, what the weather patterns were because of dust storms in the region, whether depleted uranium was used in that region. For example, there are armor-piercing rounds, PGU-14, and tank shells with depleted uranium, as well as even ship ballast, and whether that soldier used personal protective equipment. All these things are important. Regarding training, in the VA system, most compensation and pension doctors that we've dealt with in the VA are primary care doctors. They're not pulmonologists, and they're unaware of burn pit issues, which actually is flabbergasting at this point in time. But as I mentioned, last month we had a case where somebody could not go to the War-Related Illness and Injury Center, which has been an arbiter and an advocate for us. So they would go to East Orange VA to confirm what we suspected or wanted a second confirmation of. And one stumbling block is the local VAs are using it as a hurdle to not get them benefits.
Do you think the VAs need to have pulmonologists on staff?
Yes.
Well, thank you for all your recommendations. I think this panel has been extremely effective in laying out a set of requirements and proposals for how to better address the diseases caused by burn pits and how to document them through active duty so that when these individuals become veteran status, they have all the information they need to protect them. Because a lot of these diseases take 5 years or take 7 years or take 10 years, depending on the length of the service of the individual. And so we need to have that information in place at the ready so that when they do go from active duty to veteran status, it's part of their record. We're going to leave this record open for a week. So if there's any testimony that you think of that you would like to give in terms of recommendations, in terms of data, information, anything else that you want us to have, please submit it. We're really grateful for your advocacy and your testimony today. I think it was thorough and extremely helpful in writing our baseline personnel markup. Thank you very much. Hearing adjourned.